Sarah Martinez thought losing everything to her cheating husband was rock bottom. Left with nothing but debt and a 6-year-old daughter, she never expected the strange letter about inheriting her great-uncle's property in the Amazon rainforest. The crumbling stone structure seemed like another cruel joke from life. Vines strangled the walls, rooms led nowhere, and the whole place felt more like a prison than a home. But when little Emma's ball rolled through a loose floorboard, Sarah discovered something that would change their lives forever. Deep beneath the rotting wood lay a pit filled with more gold than most people see in movies. But why did her husband try so desperately to keep this inheritance from her? The wedding ring felt heavier than it ever had as Sarah stared at the bank statement in her trembling hands. 23 years of marriage, and Marcus had drained their savings down to $47. The numbers blurred through her tears as she traced the withdrawals with her finger. Cash advance after cash advance, all dated during his business trips to Denver. "Mama, why are you crying again?" Emma's small voice cut through the silence of their cramped apartment kitchen. At 6 years old, her daughter had witnessed too many tears these past few months. Sarah quickly folded the statement and slipped it beneath the pile of overdue notices that had become her daily reading material. "Just thinking about grown-up things, sweetheart." Sarah forced a smile and pulled Emma onto her lap. The child's warm weight against her chest was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality these days. "Did you finish your coloring?" Emma nodded, her dark curls bouncing. She had Marcus's eyes, but thankfully nothing else of his character. "I drew us in a big house with a garden. Like the one you used to tell me about from when you were little. The house Sarah's grandmother had described in her stories. A place that existed only in memory and imagination now. Just like the financial security she'd thought they had. Just like the faithful husband she'd believed Marcus to be. The diamond on her wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through their window. Such a modest stone, chosen when they were young and hopeful and believed love could overcome anything. Marcus had insisted they buy it together, pooling their minimum wage paychecks for 3 months to afford the simple setting. Back then, it represented partnership, sacrifice, shared dreams. Now it mocked her with its persistent sparkle. Sarah twisted the ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed since finding the first hotel receipt in Marcus's jacket pocket 6 months ago. She'd confronted him then, voice shaking with hurt and confusion. He'd held her while she cried, promised it was a mistake, sworn he'd never seen the woman before. The receipt must have blown into his car at the gas station. How desperate she'd been to believe him. More evidence had trickled in like water through cracks in a foundation. Lipstick that wasn't hers on his collar, strange charges on their credit card, phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Each discovery had chipped away at her trust until the foundation of their marriage crumbled completely. The final blow came 3 weeks ago when she'd driven to his office to surprise him with lunch. Through the restaurant window across the street, she'd watched her husband of 23 years feed strawberries to a woman young enough to be their daughter. The same woman from the hotel receipt, the same woman whose name appeared as the beneficiary on the life insurance policy Sarah had discovered hidden in Marcus's desk drawer. "Mama, your hands are shaking." Emma's observation pulled Sarah back to the present. She looked down at her fingers, still wrapped around the ring. Her daughter was right. Everything about her shook these days. Her hands when she tried to sleep, her voice when she called about job interviews. Her entire world that had been built on lies. "I'm okay, baby girl." She kissed the top of Emma's head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. At least that small luxury they could still afford. "How about we make some sandwiches for dinner? Peanut butter again? Peanut butter again." Emma didn't complain. She'd learned not to ask for much lately, and that broke Sarah's heart more than Marcus's betrayal ever could. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to understand why Mama cried in the shower, or why they'd moved from their house to this tiny apartment, or why Daddy didn't live with them anymore. Sarah pulled the ring from her finger and set it on the kitchen counter. The pale band of skin beneath it looked foreign, like a scar that hadn't quite healed. She'd worn that ring every day for over 2 decades, through pregnancy and sleepless nights with a colicky baby, through Marcus's job losses and her mother's funeral, through what she'd believed were the building blocks of a life well lived. The ring sat there like an accusation, a reminder of promises broken and trust shattered, but also, perhaps, a symbol of freedom she hadn't yet learned to embrace. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd take it to the pawn shop downtown. The modest diamond might buy them groceries for a week, maybe 2 if she shopped carefully. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was also an ending, and sometimes, Sarah was learning, endings were exactly what you needed before something better could begin. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a disconnection notice and a credit card bill. Sarah almost threw it away with the rest of the mail until she noticed the law firm's letterhead, Pemberton, Wade and Associates, from somewhere called Leticia, Colombia. She tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, expecting another debt collection notice. Instead, she found herself staring at words that made no sense. Inheritance, property, Amazon rainforest. The name jumped off the page like a ghost from her childhood, Eduardo Martinez Santos, her great-uncle. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered to the empty kitchen. Emma looked up from her cereal bowl, milk dripping from her spoon. "What's a mistake, Mama?" Sarah read the letter again, more slowly this time. Eduardo Martinez Santos had died 3 months ago, leaving his entire estate to his beloved grandniece, Sarah Elena Martinez. The property was described as a substantial stone structure on 47 acres of protected rainforest land. The letter requested her presence in Colombia within 30 days to claim the inheritance. Her great-uncle Eduardo. She hadn't thought about him in years. Sarah walked to the small box of family photos she'd salvaged from their old house. Buried beneath pictures of Emma's first steps and family Christmas mornings, she found what she was looking for. A faded photograph from her childhood, edges brown with age. There he was, Uncle Eduardo, tall and mysterious, standing beside her grandmother at a family gathering. Sarah must have been 7 or 8 when the picture was taken. Eduardo wore a wide-brimmed hat and clothes that looked like they belonged in an adventure movie. Even in the old photograph, his eyes held secrets. "Tell me about the castle again, Abuela," young Sarah had begged during those summer visits to her grandmother's house. "Ay, mija, you and your stories." Her grandmother would shake her head but always continue. "Eduardo, he was different from the rest of us, always dreaming of treasure and adventure. He went to Colombia when he was barely 20, chasing stories about gold in the jungle. Did he find treasure, Abuela? Who knows? He built himself a big stone house deep in the rainforest, like a castle, he wrote in his letters. But Eduardo, he was always dramatic. Could make a grocery store sound like a palace if he wanted to." Sarah had treasured those stories, imagining her mysterious great-uncle living in a jungle castle surrounded by exotic birds and hidden treasures. As she grew older, the stories seemed less magical and more like family folklore. When her grandmother passed away 10 years ago, the tales of Uncle Eduardo's jungle castle had been buried with her. Now, holding the inheritance letter, those childhood dreams crashed back into her adult reality. Emma climbed onto the chair beside her, drawn by the old photograph. "Who's that man with the funny hat?" "That's your great-great-uncle, Eduardo, my grandmother's brother. He looks like a pirate." Sarah studied the photograph more carefully. Eduardo did have an adventurous quality about him. The confident stance, the slight smile that suggested he knew something others didn't. Behind him in the photo, she could make out what looked like a jungle backdrop, though she'd always assumed it was just the photography studio's exotic setting. "Mama, why are you crying happy tears?" Sarah touched her cheek, surprised to find it damp. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, when everything seems impossible, something wonderful can happen." The letter mentioned a modest trust fund to cover travel expenses and initial property maintenance. Even modest meant more money than Sarah had seen in months. But more than that, it meant possibility. It meant escape from the suffocating weight of Marcus's betrayal and their financial ruin. She thought about Emma's drawing yesterday, the big house with a garden. What if it didn't have to remain a fantasy? Would you like to go on an adventure, baby girl? A real one? Emma's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. What kind of adventure? Sarah looked at the photograph again, at Uncle Eduardo's confident expression, the kind where we discover what we're really made of. That afternoon, Sarah called the law firm in Colombia. The voice on the other end was kind but businesslike. Yes, the inheritance was legitimate. Yes, the property was substantial, though it required significant maintenance. Yes, they could arrange transportation and temporary accommodation in Leticia while she surveyed the estate. "Is it safe?" Sarah asked, thinking of Emma. "The property is quite remote, Signora, but secure. Your uncle lived there alone for over 30 years. The local community knew him well." That evening, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table with Emma, showing her Colombia on the world map she'd printed from the library computer. The inheritance might be a crumbling ruin in the middle of nowhere. It might be worth nothing, but nothing was exactly what she had now. And sometimes, nothing was the perfect place to start over. The boat engine sputtered to silence as Carlos guided them toward a wooden dock that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Sarah clutched Emma's hand as they stepped carefully onto the weathered planks, their suitcases heavy in the humid air. "There," Carlos pointed through the dense green wall of vegetation. "Casa de Don Eduardo." Sarah squinted but saw only jungle, vines thick as her waist twisted around trees that disappeared into a canopy so dense it blocked most of the sky. The air hung heavy with moisture and the scent of growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out with a sound like laughter. "I don't see anything," Emma whispered. "Follow me, pequeña." Carlos shouldered their bags and started up a path Sarah hadn't noticed until he began walking. Don Eduardo, he liked his privacy. They climbed for 20 minutes through vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim the trail. Butterflies the size of dinner plates fluttered past Emma's face, their wings electric blue and black. Sarah's shirt stuck to her back with sweat, and she began to wonder if this whole journey had been a terrible mistake. Then the jungle opened up. Sarah stopped walking and stared. Rising from a cleared area like something from a fever dream stood the most bizarre structure she'd ever seen. It wasn't a house. It wasn't quite a castle either, despite her grandmother's stories. It was something else entirely. The building sprawled across the clearing in sections that made no architectural sense. Stone walls 15 feet high connected to shorter wooden structures. Towers rose at odd intervals, some round, others square, none matching in height or style. Covered walkways snaked between different sections like puzzle pieces forced together by a madman. "Mama, it looks like a giant built it," Emma said in an awed whisper. "Don Eduardo." "He added to it for 30 years, Carlos explained, setting down their bags. Whenever he found interesting stones or wood, he would build another room. Sometimes he would tear down what he built the year before and start over. The house, it grew like a living thing." Sarah walked closer to the main entrance. The wooden door was massive, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Above it, stone arches created shadows that moved strangely in the dappled jungle light. Windows appeared at random intervals, some large enough to drive a car through, others barely wide enough for a child to squeeze past. Was he an architect? Don Eduardo was many things. "Come, I show you inside." The interior was even more disorienting than the exterior. Corridors led in directions that defied the building's footprint. Stairs climbed to rooms that couldn't possibly exist based on what Sarah had seen from outside. Some rooms had ceilings 20 feet high, others she could touch by standing on her toes. "It's like a maze," Emma said, her voice echoing strangely. Carlos led them to what he called the main living area. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt comfortable and lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes in Spanish, English, and languages Sarah couldn't identify. A large wooden desk sat beneath windows that looked out into the jungle canopy. On the desk, as if waiting for her arrival, lay an ancient leather journal. "Don Eduardo left this for you," Carlos said. "He told me if his grandniece ever comes, give her the journal first. Everything else can wait." Sarah opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellow with age, but the ink remained clear. Eduardo's handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the care of someone who chose his words carefully. Day 1 in the jungle, I came seeking gold, but found something more valuable. This place holds secrets that go back centuries. The indigenous people speak of treasures hidden by their ancestors, protected by the earth itself. I will build my home here and search until I understand what they were protecting. Sarah flipped through pages filled with maps, sketches of stone carvings, and notes about ceremonial chambers and sacred geometry. Some entries were practical, detailing the construction of different rooms. Others read like the journal of an explorer documenting an archaeological discovery. Day 847. The foundation stones revealed a pattern today. What I thought was random construction was actually following lines marked by ancient peoples. My house isn't built on their sacred site, it's built to protect it. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve. Can we explore more rooms? Carlos checked his watch. I must return to town before dark, but I come back tomorrow with supplies. You have food, water, generator for electricity. Don Eduardo, he lived simply but comfortably. As Carlos's boat engine faded into the distance, Sarah stood in the living room with Emma beside her and Eduardo's journal in her hands. The jungle pressed close to the windows, alive with sounds she couldn't identify. This place was nothing like the romantic castle of her grandmother's stories. It was stranger, more mysterious. And somehow, despite its bizarre architecture and isolated location, it felt like the first place in months where she could breathe freely. Mama, do you think there's really treasure here? Sarah looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at the journal filled with 30 years of her great-uncle's search for something precious. Outside, the jungle settled into its evening rhythms. Inside this impossible house, anything seemed possible. I think, sweetheart, we're about to find out. Emma's rubber ball bounced once, twice, then disappeared. Sarah looked up from Eduardo's journal, where she'd been reading about sacred chambers beneath the foundation, and watched her daughter stare at the floor in confusion. Where did it go? Emma asked, crouching down to peer at the wooden planks. It probably rolled under the couch, Sarah said absently, turning back to her great-uncle's increasingly cryptic entries. She'd been reading for 2 hours while Emma played, trying to make sense of his references to protective barriers and ancient wealth. Mama, come look. Something in Emma's voice made Sarah set down the journal. Her daughter was lying flat on her stomach, pressing her face against the floor near the massive stone fireplace. The ball fell inside the floor, Emma said. I can hear it rolling around down there. Sarah knelt beside her daughter. The wooden planks in this section of the room looked different from the rest, older, more weathered and slightly warped. When she pressed down, one of the boards gave slightly under her weight. Step back, sweetheart. Sarah examined the suspicious board more carefully. It was loose, definitely, and when she worked her fingers around its edges, she could feel it shift. The wood was held in place by what looked like decorative metal work, but as she studied the pattern, she realized it wasn't decorative at all. It was a mechanism. Look at this, she murmured, tracing the metalwork with her finger. The design formed a series of interlocking spirals that matched drawings she'd seen in Eduardo's journal. When she pressed the center spiral and turned it clockwise, something clicked deep beneath the floor. The board tilted up like a hinged door. Emma gasped. Below the floorboard lay a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Cool air rose from the opening, carrying a metallic scent that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Can we go down and get my ball? Emma asked. Sarah peered into the shadowy depths. She could make out the first few steps, carved from the same stone as the house's exterior walls. Eduardo's journal had mentioned underground chambers, but she'd assumed he meant a basement or storage area. This looked like something much older. Wait here, Sarah said, retrieving the flashlight Carlos had left with their supplies. I'll get your ball. The stone steps were worn smooth, as if countless feet had walked this path over many years. Sarah counted 12 steps before reaching a small landing. The air was cooler here, and her flashlight beam revealed another set of steps continuing downward. Mama, What do you see? Just old stairs, baby. Your ball probably bounced down here somewhere. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew this was about more than a lost toy. The stonework was too precise, too carefully constructed for a simple storage area. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this hidden space. She descended the second set of stairs, counting 15 more steps. The metallic scent grew stronger, and her flashlight began picking up reflections from the walls, not the dull reflection of normal stone, but something that glittered. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah's flashlight beam swept across a sight that made her forget how to breathe. The chamber was roughly circular, carved entirely from stone, but it wasn't the architecture that stopped her heart. It was what filled the chamber. Gold, not a few coins or pieces of jewelry. Gold bars stacked like firewood against the walls, gold coins spilling from stone urns, gold artifacts and ornaments scattered across stone shelves as if someone had been cataloguing treasures for decades. Sarah's hands shook as she moved the flashlight beam around the chamber. This wasn't possible. People didn't just inherit rooms full of gold. This had to be a dream or some elaborate joke. Or her light landed on something near the center of the chamber, a round object that reflected her beam with mirror-like intensity. Emma's ball sat beside a golden medallion the size of a dinner plate. Sarah approached slowly, afraid that sudden movements might make the entire vision disappear. The medallion was covered in the same spiral patterns she'd seen on the floor mechanism upstairs. But these weren't just decorative. They were instructions, she realized, studying the intricate carvings, a map, perhaps, or directions to other chambers. She picked up Emma's ball with one hand and the medallion with the other. The gold was heavy, real, warm to the touch despite the cool chamber air. No costume jewelry, this. This was pure gold, worked by artisans who understood their craft. "Mama, did you find my ball?" Emma's voice echoed down the stairwell, bringing Sarah back to reality. She looked around the chamber one more time, her flashlight beam catching reflection after reflection of impossible wealth. Eduardo hadn't been crazy, he'd been methodical. All those years of construction, all those seemingly random additions to the house, he'd been building around this chamber, protecting it, hiding it in plain sight. "Coming, sweetheart." Sarah climbed the stone steps with Emma's ball in one pocket and the golden medallion wrapped in her jacket. Her mind raced with questions. How much gold was down there? Where had it come from? Why had Eduardo left it to her? But underneath the questions ran a deeper current of realization. Everything had changed. Her life, Emma's future, everything she'd thought impossible just moments ago. She emerged from the hidden chamber and carefully closed the wooden panel, watching the mechanism click back into place. "Here's your ball, baby girl." Emma took the ball and immediately began bouncing it again, already forgetting the mystery of where it had gone. But Sarah would never forget. She touched the medallion through her jacket fabric, feeling its weight against her ribs. Somewhere below their feet lay more wealth than most people could imagine, and somehow, impossibly, it was theirs. Sarah waited until Emma fell asleep before returning to the hidden chamber. The golden medallion lay on Eduardo's desk like a piece of captured sunlight, but it was what she'd found beneath it that kept her awake with rage. Legal documents, stacks of them, bound with red ribbon and sealed in a waterproof container that had been sitting in that chamber for months, possibly years. Now, by the light of Eduardo's old desk lamp, Sarah spread the papers across the wooden surface and tried to control her shaking hands long enough to read them properly. The first document was a letter addressed to Marcus, her Marcus, dated 18 months ago. "Mr. Martinez," the letter began in Eduardo's careful handwriting, "I am writing to inform you that your wife, Sarah Elena Martinez, stands to inherit substantial property upon my death. As her husband, I felt you should be aware of this inheritance so that your family can prepare accordingly." Sarah's vision blurred. She blinked hard and continued reading. "The property includes 47 acres of protected rainforest land and a stone residence I've spent 30 years constructing. There are also certain family assets that have been in the Martinez family for generations. I trust you will ensure that Sarah understands the full scope of what she will inherit." The letter was signed and notarized. Attached was a copy of Eduardo's will, clearly showing Sarah as the sole beneficiary of an estate valued at substantial but undetermined, worth pending professional appraisal. Marcus had known. For 18 months he had known. Sarah's hands moved to the second document, a response letter from Marcus to Eduardo. Her husband's familiar handwriting made her stomach turn. "Mr. Martinez Santos, thank you for your letter regarding my wife's potential inheritance. I believe it would be best if Sarah were not informed about this matter until after your passing. She has been under considerable stress lately, and news of an inheritance might give her unrealistic expectations about our financial future. I think it would be kinder to let her discover this naturally when the time comes. Please direct all further correspondence about this matter through my office." The office address listed was not Marcus's real workplace. Sarah recognized it as a mailbox rental facility across town. Her breath came in short, angry bursts. Marcus had intercepted her inheritance information. He had deliberately kept her in the dark while their marriage fell apart, while she struggled to pay bills, while she lay awake at night wondering how they'd afford Emma's school supplies. The third document made her grab the desk edge to steady herself. It was a contract between Marcus and something called Amazonia Holdings Limited, dated 6 months ago. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the intent was clear. Marcus had sold information about Eduardo's property to a company specializing in resource extraction in remote locations. The payment amount made Sarah's eyes widen. $50,000, paid to Marcus for detailed property information and access consultation regarding inheritance timeline. He had sold her inheritance. Before she even knew it existed, Marcus had sold information about it to strangers. But the worst document lay beneath all the others, a divorce petition, filed by Marcus 3 months ago but never served. The reason for divorce was listed as irreconcilable differences, but the financial disclosure section told a different story. Marcus had listed their shared assets as minimal and made no mention of any potential inheritance. He had been planning to divorce her after Eduardo died, after he'd figured out a way to claim or access whatever Eduardo had left her. The affair, the financial betrayal, the emotional cruelty, it had all been calculated to drive her away at exactly the right time. Sarah found herself laughing, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It echoed strangely in Eduardo's living room, mixing with the night sounds of the jungle outside. Marcus had assumed Eduardo's inheritance was the property itself, maybe a run-down house he could sell to developers or timber companies. He'd sold information about 47 acres of jungle and a stone house built by an eccentric old man. He had no idea about the chamber beneath her feet, no idea about the gold that represented more wealth than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of his miserable schemes. Sarah carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in their waterproof container. Evidence. If Marcus and his Amazonia Holdings friends came looking for Eduardo's legacy, she'd be ready for them. She walked to the window and looked out into the jungle darkness. Somewhere out there, animals moved through the canopy on their nightly hunts, predators and prey, each playing their role in an ancient dance of survival. Marcus thought he was the predator in this story. He thought he'd outmaneuvered his naive wife, positioned himself to profit from a family inheritance that belonged to her. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. Sarah touched the golden medallion on the desk behind her. Tomorrow she would explore the rest of Eduardo's house, look for more hidden chambers, more evidence of what her great-uncle had spent 30 years protecting. Tonight she would plan what to do about her husband's betrayal. The woman who'd arrived in the jungle yesterday had been a victim, broken by circumstances beyond her control. The woman standing at this window was something different entirely. Marcus had taught her one valuable lesson through his cruelty. Sometimes the person you trust most is the one you should fear the most. It was a lesson she planned to return to him with interest. The stone tablet was embedded in the wall of what Eduardo had called the map room, though Sarah couldn't understand why, until she studied it more carefully in the morning light. After Emma had eaten her breakfast of crackers and canned fruit, Sarah had decided to explore more of Eduardo's bizarre house. Her daughter skipped ahead through corridors that seemed to follow no logical pattern, while Sarah tried to make sense of her great-uncle's architectural choices. "Look, Mama, this room has pictures in the rocks." Emma had discovered the map room by accident, chasing a butterfly that had somehow gotten inside the house. The room was smaller than the main living area, with walls covered in what Sarah had initially mistaken for decorative stonework. Now, studying the walls more closely, she realized they weren't decorations at all. They were maps. Carved into the stone were detailed representations of the surrounding jungle, complete with topographical features, river systems, and what looked like man-made structures. Some of the carvings were clearly Eduardo's work, precise and modern, but others appeared much older, weathered by time and executed in a different style entirely. The tablet that had caught Emma's attention was positioned at the center of the wall like a keystone. About the size of a book, it showed the same spiral patterns from the medallion and the floor mechanism, but arranged in a more complex configuration. "It's like a puzzle, isn't it, Mama?" Emma was right. The spirals on the tablet connected to lines that spread across the wall maps, marking specific locations both inside and outside the house. Sarah counted 7 distinct marking points within the house itself, and dozens more scattered throughout the surrounding jungle. She traced one of the lines with her finger, following it from the tablet to a point that seemed to correspond with the hidden chamber they'd discovered yesterday. Another line led to a location she estimated was directly beneath where they stood now. "Emma, do you remember playing with that ball yesterday when it fell through the floor?" "Uh-huh, and we found the pretty room with all the shiny things." Sarah smiled at her daughter's matter-of-fact description of a chamber full of gold. "What if I told you there might be more pretty rooms hidden in this house?" Emma's eyes grew wide. "Like a treasure hunt?" "Exactly like a treasure hunt." Sarah studied the tablet more carefully, noting symbols carved around its border. Some matched marks she'd seen in Eduardo's journal, but others were clearly older, much older. The worn quality of certain symbols suggested they predated Eduardo's residence by centuries. Following the wall map, Sarah identified the location most likely to correspond with the marking directly beneath them. It should be accessible from the room Eduardo had used as a workshop, if her reading of the stone map was correct. They made their way through 3 connecting corridors to reach the workshop. Unlike other rooms in the house, this space felt purely functional. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools for stone carving, woodworking, and metalworking. But it was the floor that interested Sarah now. "Help me move these boxes, sweetheart." Together, they cleared away storage containers from a section of floor that looked different from the rest. Where most of the workshop had wooden planks, this area was covered with flat stones arranged in a pattern that matched the spiral design from the tablet. Sarah knelt and pressed the center stone, turning it the way she had with the wooden floor mechanism. Again, she heard the satisfying click of an ancient lock releasing. But instead of a hinged panel, the entire spiral of stones rotated as a unit, revealing another set of stairs descending into darkness. "Another pretty room?" Emma asked hopefully. This chamber was larger than the first, carved entirely from living rock. But where the first chamber had been filled with gold artifacts and coins, this one contained something different. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding pottery vessels, carved figurines, and tools that looked like they belonged in a museum. And books. Dozens of books in various states of preservation, some bound in leather, others carved on stone tablets, a few that appeared to be made from some kind of bark or plant material. Sarah opened one of the leather-bound volumes carefully. The text was in Spanish, but the ink was so faded she could barely make out individual words. What she could read made her heart race. Chronicle of the Jaguar Kings, Volume 7, The Hidden Wealth of Tahuamanu. This wasn't just Eduardo's collection. This was a repository of knowledge that went back generations, possibly centuries. Her great-uncle hadn't been treasure hunting for 30 years. He'd been protecting something that others had been protecting for much longer. Sarah thought about the stone tablet upstairs, with its 7 markings inside the house alone. If each marking represented a hidden chamber like these two. "Mama, there's more stairs down here." Emma had wandered to the far end of the chamber, where another set of stone steps descended into deeper darkness. Sarah joined her daughter at the edge of the stairwell. Her flashlight beam couldn't reach the bottom, but she could feel air movement suggesting the passage continued for a significant distance. How deep did this system go? How many chambers had Eduardo discovered and protected? And what was so important that it required this level of secrecy? The carved stone tablet upstairs wasn't just a map of hidden rooms. It was a guide to something much larger. A network of protection that her great-uncle had spent his life maintaining. And now, somehow, that responsibility had fallen to her. The key was hidden inside a carved wooden jaguar that sat on Eduardo's bookshelf, its amber eyes watching over his collection of journals and maps. Sarah discovered it by accident when Emma knocked the figurine over while reaching for a colorful bird book. The jaguar's head had split along a nearly invisible seam, revealing a hollow interior and a brass key unlike any Sarah had ever seen. Instead of normal teeth, this key featured the same spiral patterns she'd been finding throughout the house, but worked in miniature with stunning precision. "I'm sorry, Mama, I didn't mean to break it." "You didn't break anything, sweetheart." Sarah examined the two halves of the jaguar. The split was clearly intentional, designed to hide the key while keeping it accessible. "I think your great-great-uncle Eduardo wanted someone to find this." But find what? Sarah had been through every room in the main house, and the key was unlike any lock she'd encountered. It was too ornate for a simple door, too small for the chamber mechanisms they'd discovered. Emma picked up the bird book that had started this discovery and began flipping through pages of colorful parrots and toucans. "Look, Mama, the birds here have the same colors as the real ones outside." Sarah glanced at the book, then stopped and looked more carefully. The illustrations were beautifully detailed, but more importantly, they were annotated in Eduardo's handwriting. Notes about bird behavior, nesting locations, and feeding patterns filled the margins. But one note caught her attention. The sacred ibis returns to the place of first seeing. Follow the white wings to the heart of memory. Sarah studied the illustration of a white ibis, noting that Eduardo had drawn an arrow pointing from the bird to what looked like a room layout in the margin. The drawing showed walls, doorways, and in the center, a lock mechanism that perfectly matched the ornate key in her hand. "Emma, do you remember seeing any white birds since we've been here? The pretty white one that sits by the big window every morning?" Sarah remembered. A large white bird had been perched outside the main living room window both yesterday and today, always in the same spot. She'd assumed it was coincidental, but what if Eduardo had trained local wildlife as part of his security system? They returned to the living room, and sure enough, the white ibis sat on a branch just outside the window, preening its feathers in the afternoon sun. Sarah studied the wall beneath the window more carefully. The stonework here was different from the rest of the room. Smoother, more carefully fitted, and when she pressed her palm against it, slightly warm to the touch. She ran her fingers along the stone joints, looking for anything that might correspond to Eduardo's margin drawing. "There," she whispered, finding what felt like a small hole hidden behind what looked like natural stone texture. The ornate key slid into the opening as if it had been made for this specific lock. When Sarah turned it, she heard not just one click, but a series of mechanical sounds, as if multiple locks were releasing in sequence. A section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed based on the house's exterior structure. Eduardo's true study lay beyond the hidden door. Unlike the comfortable, lived-in main room, this space was organized with scientific precision. Maps covered every wall, but these weren't the tourist maps you'd find in a guidebook. These were surveyor-quality topographical maps marked with geological formations, water tables, and what looked like mining assessments. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with dates spanning 30 years. The desk held a modern computer alongside surveying equipment and scales precise enough for weighing gold. But it was the family tree drawn on the largest wall that made Sarah catch her breath. Starting with names and dates from the 1800s, The family tree traced the Martinez lineage through multiple generations. Sarah found her grandmother's name, then her mother's, then her own. But what shocked her was seeing Marcus's name included in the tree, connected to hers with a red line and marked with warning symbols. Below the family tree, Eduardo had maintained detailed files on each family member. Sarah's file was thick, including copies of her school records, wedding announcement, employment history, and even recent photographs she was certain she'd never sent him. Marcus's file was thicker. Banking records, employment history, credit reports, and investigation notes dating back 3 years. Eduardo had hired private investigators to document Marcus's activities. The affair, the financial irregularities, the secret business dealings. Eduardo had known everything. A note in Eduardo's handwriting was clipped to the front of Marcus's file. Sarah's husband poses a significant threat to family legacy. He has been in contact with commercial interests seeking to exploit indigenous lands. If anything happens to me, Sarah must be warned immediately. The protection of our ancestral responsibility cannot fall into the wrong hands. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mama, what's ancestral responsibility?" Sarah looked down at her daughter, this bright, curious child who had just become the next generation in a legacy she was only beginning to understand. "It means, sweetheart, that sometimes families are given something very important to take care of, and they have to make sure it stays safe for the people who come after them. Like baby birds?" "Like baby birds," Sarah agreed, "except what we're taking care of is much more important than birds." Through the window, the white ibis cried once and flew away, its job complete. The coded message was hidden in plain sight, written in the margins of Eduardo's bird identification book using what appeared to be random numbers and letters. Sarah might never have noticed it if she hadn't been looking for more of his cryptic notes after discovering his secret study. Emma was napping in the afternoon heat when Sarah spread the bird book across Eduardo's desk and began studying the seemingly meaningless notations. At first glance, they looked like scientific observations, bird counts perhaps, or behavioral notes. W17E23DHG15, beside an illustration of a harpy eagle, a 1M13, a 1Z260 15N499 next to a toucan. But when Sarah looked closer, she realized the numbers corresponded to alphabet positions. W was the 23rd letter, E was the 5th. She grabbed a piece of paper and began translating. Wedge from the first notation, Amazonia from the second. Her pulse quickened as she worked through more marginal notes, finding message fragments scattered throughout the book. Danger approaching, stop commercial interests, identified stop helicopter surveys, reported stop extraction teams, mobilizing, stop. The messages were dated, she realized, checking the tiny numbers beneath each code. The most recent was from just 2 months ago. Marcus contact confirmed. Stop Sarah location compromised. Stop activate emergency protocols. Stop. Sarah's hands shook as she decoded the final message, dated just 3 weeks before Eduardo's death. If reading this, I am gone. Stop treasure hunters, no property location. Stop Amazonia Holdings advanced team en route. Stop trust no one from outside. Stop protect legacy at all costs. Stop Amazonia Holdings, the same company that had paid Marcus $50,000 for information about Eduardo's property. Sarah closed the bird book and walked to the window. The jungle looked peaceful in the afternoon light, but suddenly every sound made her nervous. How long before Marcus realized she'd actually claimed the inheritance? How long before he shared her location with his business partners? She thought about Carlos, the friendly boat captain who'd brought them here. Could she trust him? He'd known Eduardo for years, seemed genuinely respectful of the old man's memory. But Eduardo's message warned against trusting anyone from outside. A sound made her freeze, not a jungle sound, something mechanical, distant but growing closer. Sarah crept to the window and peered through the glass. There, above the jungle canopy, a small aircraft circled the area where Eduardo's property should be. From this distance, she couldn't tell if it was a plane or helicopter, but it was definitely searching for something. The aircraft made 3 passes over their area before disappearing toward the river. Sarah remained at the window for another 10 minutes, but it didn't return. When Emma woke from her nap, Sarah tried to act normally, but her mind raced with possibilities. If treasure hunters were already searching for Eduardo's property, how long before they found it? The house was well hidden, but not invisible from the air. "Mama, can we go exploring again?" Emma asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Not today, sweetheart. I think we should stay inside and read some of Uncle Eduardo's books. But it's sunny outside, and I want to see if the pretty white bird is back." Sarah realized she needed to prepare Emma for the possibility that they might need to leave quickly, without frightening her. Her daughter had already been through enough upheaval in her young life. "Emma, do you remember how we had to pack quickly when we left our old house, when Daddy was being mean?" "Yes. Well, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and we might need to pack quickly again. If I ever tell you we need to leave right away, I want you to grab your backpack and come straight to me. Can you do that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Are we in trouble?" "No, baby girl. But some people might want to take Uncle Eduardo's house away from us, and we can't let that happen." That evening, after Emma fell asleep, Sarah returned to Eduardo's secret study and began reading through his security files. Her great-uncle had been far more prepared for trouble than she'd realized. Hidden throughout the house were motion sensors, communication equipment, and what looked like emergency supplies cached in waterproof containers. Eduardo had planned for the possibility that someone might try to take his legacy by force. But he'd also planned for something else. Sarah found detailed escape routes mapped through the jungle, safe houses marked on topographical maps, and contact information for people who could help if the situation became dangerous. Eduardo hadn't just been protecting treasure, he'd been protecting the family members who would inherit the responsibility of keeping it safe. Now that responsibility was hers, and somewhere out there, people were looking for her. The treasure chest sat in the deepest chamber Sarah had discovered yet, 3 levels below the main house. Unlike the scattered gold and artifacts in the upper chambers, this chest was clearly meant to be the centerpiece of Eduardo's collection. It was massive, carved from a single piece of dark wood and bound with gold fittings that gleamed in her flashlight beam. The lid was secured with 3 separate locking mechanisms, each requiring a different key. Fortunately, Eduardo's secret study had contained a key ring with dozens of ornate brass keys, and Sarah had brought them all. Emma held the flashlight steady, while Sarah tried different keys in the complex locks. The 3rd lock finally clicked open, and Sarah lifted the heavy lid with both hands. "Mama, it's like a pirate movie!" Emma wasn't wrong. The chest contained more gold than Sarah had seen in all the other chambers combined. Coins from different eras and countries filled one side, while the other held gold bars stacked with military precision. But it was what lay on top of the treasure that made Sarah's blood run cold. A manila folder marked Sarah, emergency documentation. Inside the folder were photographs, recent photographs. Sarah and Emma at their apartment in Phoenix, Sarah at the grocery store, Emma at her school playground, all taken with a telephoto lens by someone who'd been watching them for weeks. Beneath the surveillance photos was a contract, not the one Marcus had signed with Amazonia Holdings, but something much worse. Agreement for asset recovery and extraction services, dated just 1 month ago. The client was listed as M. Martinez, and the service provider was Blackwater Recovery Solutions. Sarah read the contract with growing horror. Marcus hadn't just sold information about Eduardo's property. He'd hired mercenaries to recover valuable assets believed to be hidden on inherited property in Colombia. The payment schedule showed he'd already made a down payment of $25,000, but the most disturbing section dealt with obstacle removal and client protection. In clinical language, the contract outlined procedures for neutralizing security threats and ensuring clean asset transfer. They weren't just planning to steal Eduardo's treasure, they were planning to make sure she couldn't stop them or report them afterward. Sarah's hands shook as she read the final page of the contract, a timeline showing that Blackwater Recovery's extraction team was scheduled to arrive in Leticia within the week. Today was Wednesday. If the timeline was accurate, Marcus and his hired mercenaries would be here by Friday. "Mama, why are you making angry faces?" Sarah looked at her daughter, this innocent child who had no idea how much danger they were in. Emma sat cross-legged on the stone floor, arranging golden coins in patterns while humming to herself. To her, this was still an adventure, a game of treasure hunting in her great-great-uncle's magical house. "Just thinking about grown-up problems, sweetheart." But as Sarah watched Emma play with the gold coins, something shifted inside her chest. A coldness she'd never felt before, sharp as winter wind. Marcus thought he could hire killers to take Eduardo's legacy. He thought he could threaten Emma's life for money. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Sarah had spent 23 years being the accommodating wife, the one who smoothed over problems and avoided confrontation. She'd endured Marcus's emotional cruelty because she thought marriage meant compromise. She'd accepted his financial betrayals because she thought love meant forgiveness. But Emma changed everything. No one threatened her daughter. No one. Sarah placed the surveillance photos back in the folder and closed the treasure chest. Eduardo had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, building defenses and escape routes, and hiding enough wealth to fight back against anyone who tried to take what belonged to the Martinez family. Now she understood why he'd chosen her as his heir, not because she was the only family member left, but because she was the one with something worth protecting, someone who would fight with everything she had when her child's life was threatened. "Emma, come here, baby girl." Emma skipped over, still holding a handful of golden coins. "We're going to play a new game," Sarah said, helping her daughter into her jacket. "A game where we practice being very quiet and very smart. Like hide and seek?" "Exactly like hide and seek. Except this time, we're not just hiding, we're getting ready to win." For the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, Sarah smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a smile of a woman who'd finally stopped running from a fight. Marcus wanted Eduardo's treasure. He was welcome to try taking it. But first, he'd have to get through her. The warning note was pinned to the front door with a knife. Sarah discovered it when she stepped outside to check the generator that powered Eduardo's security system. The blade had been driven deep into the wooden door, holding a folded piece of paper that fluttered in the morning breeze like a white flag of surrender. But Sarah was done surrendering. She pulled the knife from the door and unfolded the note. The handwriting was blocky, unfamiliar, written in English with awkward phrasing that suggested the author wasn't a native speaker. "Mrs. Martinez, we know you are here. We know what you have found. Your husband sends his regards and wishes you to understand that business is business. You have 24 hours to vacate the property. Take the child and leave. Do not make this more difficult than necessary." The note was unsigned, but at the bottom, someone had drawn a crude symbol that made Sarah's blood freeze. The same corporate logo she'd seen on Amazonia Holdings' letterhead in Marcus's contract files. They were here, not just in Colombia, but close enough to deliver handwritten threats. Sarah looked at the knife that had carried the message. It was military-grade, the kind of blade designed for more than cutting rope or opening packages. Someone had wanted her to understand exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. "Mama, come look what I found." Emma's voice carried from inside the house, bright with excitement. Sarah folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Emma didn't need to know about threats and knives and mercenaries. Not yet. She found her daughter in Eduardo's workshop, standing beside a cabinet Sarah hadn't noticed before. The child had somehow managed to open a panel that revealed shelves full of equipment that definitely hadn't been designed for woodworking. "Look, Mama, Uncle Eduardo had walkie-talkies." The radio equipment was more sophisticated than simple walkie-talkies, but Sarah didn't correct her. Among the communication devices, she spotted night vision goggles, GPS units, and what looked like military-grade emergency supplies. Eduardo hadn't just been prepared for treasure hunters. He'd been prepared for war. Sarah picked up one of the radio units and turned it on. Static filled the air, broken by occasional bursts of Spanish too rapid for her to follow. She adjusted the frequency until she caught something that made her stomach drop. "Base camp, this is Team 2. Property located. Confirm occupants on site. Copy, Team 2. Maintain surveillance. Extraction team arrives tonight. No engagement until assets are secured. Sarah turned off the radio quickly. They weren't just watching the house. They were planning to take action tonight. 24 hours had become 12 hours, maybe less. Emma was examining the night vision goggles with scientific curiosity. Why did Uncle Eduardo need these, Mama? Because sometimes grown-ups have to be very careful about who they trust. Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She wasn't running, not from Marcus, not from his hired killers, and not from the responsibility Eduardo had left her. This was Emma's inheritance as much as hers. This was their family's legacy. But she also wasn't going to wait passively for armed mercenaries to arrive. Emma, remember that game I told you about, being quiet and smart? Uh-huh. We're going to start playing it right now. I need you to help me gather some things, and then we're going to go exploring in the parts of the house that most people don't know about. Emma nodded seriously, responding to the tone in Sarah's voice. Sarah began gathering supplies from Eduardo's emergency cache: food, water, flashlights, and the communication equipment. If they were going to hide in the underground chambers, they needed to be prepared for a long stay. But as she packed, Sarah found herself thinking about the knife that had delivered the warning note, the casual violence it represented, the assumption that she would be too frightened to resist. Marcus had always underestimated her. Throughout their marriage, he'd treated her like a child who needed protection from difficult decisions. Even his betrayal had been based on the assumption that she was too naive to discover his schemes. Now he'd made the same mistake with hired killers. They expected a frightened woman who would grab her child and run at the first sign of trouble. They were prepared for resistance from Eduardo's security systems, but not from the woman who'd inherited them. Sarah picked up the military knife and tested its weight in her hand. She'd never held a weapon before, but it felt surprisingly natural, balanced, ready. Mama, are we going to hide from bad people? For a little while, sweetheart, but only until we figure out how to make them go away. Emma took her hand with complete trust. Will the pretty rooms keep us safe? Sarah looked down at her daughter, then at the equipment Eduardo had left for exactly this situation. Yes, baby girl, the pretty rooms will keep us safe, and then we're going to keep them safe too. The revelation document was hidden in Eduardo's most secure chamber, 4 levels beneath the house in a vault that required both the golden medallion and a specific sequence of stone movements to open. Sarah had spent 2 hours following Eduardo's cryptic instructions, while Emma slept in the upper chambers, protected by locks that would take explosives to breach. What she found in that final vault changed everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her life, and Marcus's betrayal. The document was professionally bound, stamped with legal seals, and titled in bold letters that made Sarah's vision blur with rage. Operational Plan, Martinez Inheritance Extraction, Phase 1 through completion. It was dated 3 years ago, 3 years before Eduardo's death, 3 years before the inheritance letter had arrived in her mailbox. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the opening summary. Subject: Sarah Elena Martinez. Target: Eduardo Martinez Santos Estate. Estimated value: $200 to $300 million in recoverable assets. Operation duration: 36 months. Primary asset: Marcus Martinez, subject's husband. Marcus hadn't just betrayed her for money, he'd been recruited specifically to marry her, to gain access to her family, to position himself for this exact moment. The document laid out everything with clinical precision. How Amazonia Holdings had identified Eduardo's property through satellite surveys and geological reports. How they'd discovered the Martinez family connection through public records. How they'd researched Eduardo's potential heirs and identified Sarah as the most likely inheritor. And how they'd found Marcus, a struggling insurance salesman with gambling debts and flexible morals, perfect for a 3-year undercover operation. Page after page detailed Marcus's instructions: win Sarah's trust, isolate her from her extended family, monitor all communications that might mention Eduardo, report any contact from Colombia immediately. The financial records were even worse. Marcus had been paid a monthly salary for 23 years of marriage. Every anniversary, every birthday, every moment of intimacy she'd treasured had been purchased and planned by corporate interests seeking Eduardo's gold. But it was the final section that broke something fundamental inside Sarah's chest. Phase 4, relationship termination and asset positioning. Upon Eduardo Martinez Santos's death, subject Marcus will initiate divorce proceedings designed to create emotional distress and financial desperation in primary target. This will ensure target's immediate departure for Colombia to claim inheritance, providing optimal access window for extraction team deployment. The affair hadn't been Marcus falling in love with someone else. It had been a calculated psychological attack designed to drive Sarah to exactly this place, at exactly this time, in exactly the emotional state that would make her most vulnerable. Even Emma's presence here had been planned. The document specified that a child would provide emotional leverage and compliance motivation if target proved resistant to cooperation. Sarah closed the document and sat in the stone silence of Eduardo's deepest vault. Around her, ancient treasures gleamed in the flashlight beam, gold that had been protected by her family for generations, wealth that represented not just money but a sacred trust passed down through bloodlines that stretched back centuries. Marcus had turned her entire life into a lie, not just the recent betrayal she'd been grieving, but everything. Their meeting at the coffee shop where he'd seemed so charmed by her laugh, their first date when he'd listened to her dreams with such apparent fascination, their wedding where he'd promised to love her until death parted them. All of it scripted, all of it performed for money. But the document revealed something else that Marcus and his corporate masters hadn't expected. Eduardo had known, not just suspected, but known with absolute certainty that Marcus was a plant, that Sarah's marriage was a deception, that enemies were positioning themselves to steal her family's legacy. And Eduardo had spent 3 years preparing his own counter-operation. Sarah found Eduardo's handwritten notes clipped to the back of the document. His response to every element of their plan: counter-surveillance, decoy chambers filled with worthless replicas, communication networks that bypassed normal channels, escape routes that led to allies Marcus's people would never expect. Most importantly, Eduardo had prepared Sarah herself for this moment. Every family story her grandmother had told, every childhood tale of Uncle Eduardo's adventures, every detail about their family history had been designed to prepare her for the choice she faced now: run and let them win, or fight for what belonged to her daughter's generation and all the generations that would follow. Sarah thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in the chambers above, trusting that Mama would keep her safe. Emma, who was the real target of this entire operation, not just the current treasure, but the next generation of Martinez family guardians. They wanted to break the chain of protection that had kept these treasures safe for hundreds of years. They thought they could use her own husband to manipulate her into surrender. The document had revealed the scope of their deception, but it had also revealed something they'd never intended her to discover. She wasn't the victim in this story. She was the weapon Eduardo had been preparing for 30 years. Time to show them how dangerous a prepared weapon could be. The protection charm was woven into a leather cord that Eduardo had worn around his neck for 30 years, according to the note Sarah found with it. The charm itself was a small jade carving of a jaguar, polished smooth by decades of handling, with eyes that seemed to follow her in the dim light of the underground chamber. Carlos had brought it to her. Sarah heard the boat engine just before dawn and assumed it was Marcus's extraction team arriving early. She'd grabbed Emma and retreated to the deepest chamber, sealing the entrance behind them. But the voice that called through Eduardo's communication system was familiar. "Señora Martinez, it is Carlos. I bring friends. Eduardo, he told me this day would come." Sarah had climbed back to the surface cautiously, the military knife Eduardo had left her tucked into her belt. But Carlos stood alone at the front door, holding the jade charm and wearing an expression she'd never seen before. Gone was the friendly boat captain who'd brought them here 3 days ago. In his place stood a man whose eyes held the hard alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "Eduardo was my brother," Carlos said simply. "Not blood brother, but brother in purpose. For 15 years we prepared for this day." Sarah stared at him. "You knew? About Marcus, about the treasure hunters, about everything?" "Eduardo told me many things. Your husband, he is not the man you believed him to be. But you, Senora, you are exactly the woman Eduardo hoped you would become." Carlos had brought 5 other men with him, all locals who'd worked with Eduardo over the years. Sarah recognized one as the mechanic who'd serviced the generator. Another was the man who'd delivered supplies monthly. She'd assumed they were simple service providers. She'd been wrong about that too. "We are what Eduardo called his insurance policy," Carlos explained. "Men who understand that some treasures belong to the people who have protected them for generations, not to corporations that would steal them." The jade charm felt warm in Sarah's palm as Carlos explained Eduardo's network. Hidden among the local community were former military personnel, indigenous guides who knew every trail in the region, and businessmen who could mobilize resources when needed. "Your husband's people, they think they're dealing with one woman and a child hiding in an old man's house," Carlos said. "They do not know about us. Through Eduardo's communication equipment, they'd been monitoring the extraction team's radio traffic. Marcus had arrived with 6 mercenaries and enough equipment to breach any conventional security. They planned to take the house at noon, when the jungle heat would slow any resistance. But they'd made their plans based on incomplete information. Eduardo, he showed us the chambers, taught us the passages," Carlos continued. "Every tunnel, every escape route, every hiding place. But also every choke point, every defensive position, every way to turn this house into a fortress." Sarah looked at the jade charm, understanding now why Eduardo had worn it. Not as a superstition, but as a reminder that he was never truly alone, that the responsibility of protecting their family legacy was shared by people who understood its importance. Emma emerged from the hidden chambers, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw Carlos and immediately brightened. "Mr. Carlos, did you come to help us play hide-and-seek?" "Something like that, pequeña," Carlos said gently. "Your mama and I have important work to do." Over the next hour, Carlos's team transformed Eduardo's house from a hiding place into a tactical position. They knew where Eduardo had placed motion sensors, where he'd hidden emergency supplies, how to use the house's bizarre architecture to create defensive advantages. Most importantly, they knew about the tunnels. Eduardo hadn't just built a house, he'd built a complex with multiple levels, hidden passages, and escape routes that connected to natural cave systems, extending for miles through the jungle. Anyone trying to take the house by force would find themselves in a 3-dimensional maze designed by someone who'd had 30 years to plan their defense. "Your husband, he knows about the gold," Carlos said as they reviewed their preparations. "But he knows nothing about the family who protects it." Sarah fastened the jade charm around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her chest like a promise. Emma was playing with wooden blocks in the main room, building towers and castles while the adults planned for war. She deserved to grow up in a world where family legacies were protected, where promises made by previous generations were kept. "How many people know about this?" Sarah asked. "In our community? Many. The gold, it has helped our children get education, helped our families during hard times. We do not fight for treasure. We fight for the man who shared his wealth with people who needed it." Sarah understood then that Eduardo's legacy wasn't just about protecting ancient gold, it was about protecting a network of relationships, a community of people who'd benefited from his generosity and understood the difference between stewardship and ownership. Marcus's people were about to discover that difference. The ancient weapon had been waiting in Eduardo's deepest vault, wrapped in oiled leather and resting in a stone niche carved specifically for its dimensions. Sarah discovered it while making final preparations for Marcus's arrival, and holding it felt like completing a circle that had been drawn centuries before her birth. It was a blade, unlike anything she'd seen in museums or movies. The metal was dark, almost black, with patterns that seemed to shift in the light. The handle was wrapped in leather so old it had become part of the weapon itself, worn smooth by hands that had gripped it in moments of desperate need. That belonged to your ancestor, Carlos said quietly, recognizing the weapon from Eduardo's descriptions. The woman who first hid the gold in these chambers. Legend says she took it from Spanish conquistadors who tried to steal her people's sacred treasures. Sarah tested the weapon's weight. Despite its age, the blade was perfectly balanced, sharp enough to cut paper. More importantly, holding it connected her to something larger than Marcus's betrayal or corporate greed. This weapon represented 500 years of Martinez women who'd fought to protect what belonged to their families. "Mama, why do you have a sword?" Emma had appeared in the chamber entrance, moving with the silent grace she'd developed during 3 days of playing in Eduardo's hidden passages. The child had adapted to their underground sanctuary with an ease that both amazed and worried Sarah. "It's not exactly a sword, sweetheart. It's more like a very old kitchen knife." Emma studied the weapon with serious eyes that seemed older than her 6 years. "Uncle Eduardo left it for you, didn't he? Like the pretty rooms and the treasure and all the secrets." Sometimes Emma's perceptiveness took Sarah's breath away. "How did you know that?" "Because everything here was waiting for us. The locks that opened when you touched them, the books with the maps, even Mr. Carlos and his friends. Uncle Eduardo knew we would come, and he got everything ready." From the mouth of her 6-year-old daughter, the enormity of Eduardo's preparations sounded both simple and miraculous. Sarah knelt to Emma's eye level. "Are you scared about the bad men coming?" Emma considered this seriously a little bit, but Mr. Carlos says this house has lots of hiding places, and you have Uncle Eduardo's special knife, and I know all the secret ways to go between the rooms now." "You do?" "Uh-huh. Want me to show you the passage that goes from the kitchen to the room with all the gold? The bad men won't know about it." Over the past 3 days, while Sarah had been focused on documents and weapons and defensive preparations, Emma had been exploring Eduardo's house with the fearless curiosity of a child. She'd discovered passages that Carlos hadn't known about, shortcuts between chambers that could prove crucial if they needed to move quickly. "Emma, if something happens today, if there's loud noises or scary sounds, I need you to go to the deepest room and wait for me there. Can you do that? The room with the really old books?" "Yes. And don't come out until either I come to get you or Mr. Carlos comes to get you. No one else. Promise me." Emma nodded solemnly. Then she surprised Sarah by reaching into her pocket and pulling out something that made Sarah's heart stop. A small golden figurine of a jaguar, identical in design to the jade charm around Sarah's neck. "Where did you find that?" "In the room where we found the first gold. It was sitting by itself on a shelf, like it was waiting for me." Sarah examined the figurine. Like everything else Eduardo had left them, it was both beautiful and purposeful. The gold was inscribed with tiny symbols, and when Sarah pressed a sequence of them that matched the pattern on her jade charm, the figurine opened to reveal a hollow interior. Inside was a key, smaller than the others they'd found, but crafted with the same intricate spiral pattern that appeared throughout Eduardo's security systems. "I think Uncle Eduardo left this for you specifically," Sarah said, closing the figurine and handing it back to her daughter. "Keep it safe. What does the key open?" "I don't know yet. But when we need to know, I think we'll figure it out." The radio in Carlos's hand crackled to life, movement on the river, 3 boats approaching from the north. Sarah stood, the ancient weapon feeling natural in her grip. Marcus was coming, bringing his hired killers to steal her daughter's inheritance and destroy her family's legacy. But he wasn't coming to fight one frightened woman hiding in an old man's house. He was coming to fight 5 centuries of Martinez women who'd learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to spill blood for it. Emma tucked the golden jaguar into her pocket and gave Sarah a hug that felt like a blessing. "Be careful, Mama, but don't let them take our treasure." "I won't, baby girl. I promise." The evidence of justice was stored in Eduardo's most secure safe, a modern digital vault hidden behind stone walls that had protected treasures for centuries. As gunfire echoed through the jungle around them, Sarah accessed the final component of her great-uncle's master plan. The safe contained terabytes of digital evidence collected over 3 years of investigation. Video surveillance of Marcus meeting with Amazonia Holdings executives. Audio recordings of him discussing Sarah's psychological manipulation. Financial records showing every payment he'd received for his 23-year performance as her loving husband. But the most devastating evidence was a live feed that Eduardo had secretly installed in their Phoenix apartment months before his death. Sarah watched her own life play out on the digital screen like a documentary about deception. Marcus talking to his corporate handlers while she was at work. Him coaching his girlfriend on how to be discovered at exactly the right moment to maximize emotional damage. Him practicing expressions of concern while planning her psychological breakdown. Every moment of grief she'd experienced over their failing marriage had been scripted by a man who'd viewed her pain as a professional achievement. "Carlos, status report," Sarah said into her radio while copying the files to multiple encrypted drives. "2 of their men are down. Marcus is falling back to the boats with the others, but they've called for backup." Through Eduardo's security cameras, Sarah could see Marcus screaming into his satellite phone. His carefully planned operation was collapsing, his expensive mercenaries were being defeated by local men with intimate knowledge of the terrain, and his corporate masters were demanding explanations he couldn't provide. But Sarah could also see helicopter lights in the distance. Marcus hadn't just brought one extraction team, he'd brought enough firepower to level the entire property if necessary. "Emma," Sarah called through the house communication system, "it's time to use your special key." She found her daughter in the deepest chamber, exactly where she'd promised to wait. Emma held the golden jaguar figurine in both hands, no longer frightened, but focused with the intense concentration children brought to truly important tasks. "Is it time, Mama?" "It's time, baby girl." Together, they climbed to Eduardo's communication center, where banks of electronic equipment connected his isolated house to the outside world. Sarah had wondered why her great-uncle needed such sophisticated technology in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. Now she understood. Emma's key fit perfectly into a small console, marked with symbols neither of them could read, but both of them recognized. When Emma turned the key, screens throughout the room flickered to life, showing connections being established to news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and government offices across multiple countries. Eduardo's final protocol wasn't just about protecting the treasure. It was about exposing the entire network of corruption that had tried to steal it. Sarah uploaded the evidence files to every connection Eduardo had prepared. Within minutes, Marcus's operation would be documented in newspapers, police departments, and intelligence agencies across 2 continents. Amazonia Holdings and Blackwater Recovery Solutions would find themselves under investigation by authorities who took a dim view of mercenary operations on foreign soil. But more importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, the Colombian military would be dispatched to investigate reports of armed American mercenaries operating illegally in protected rainforest areas. "Marcus," Sarah said into the external speaker system, "your backup is coming, but so is mine. Check your satellite feed." Through the security cameras, she watched Marcus frantically accessing his communication equipment. His face went ashen as he realized that his entire operation was being broadcast to law enforcement agencies who were already mobilizing to respond. The approaching helicopters weren't just his corporate backup. Mixed with them were Colombian military aircraft responding to Sarah's evidence dump. Marcus had perhaps minutes before his illegal operation became an international incident with him as the primary target. "You did this!" His voice came through the radio, no longer the controlled tone of a professional operator, but the snarl of a man watching his life collapse. 23 years, Sarah. 23 years of my life building this operation. 23 years of my life you stole, Sarah replied, but at least you were getting paid for yours. She watched him realize that he had only one choice left: run immediately and hope he could escape before the authorities arrived. Or stay and face the consequences of an operation that had been illegal from its inception. Marcus chose to run. She'd known he would. In 23 years of marriage, She'd never seen him take responsibility for anything difficult. The boats pulled away from Eduardo's dock just as military helicopters appeared over the jungle canopy. Sarah watched through Eduardo's cameras as Marcus and his remaining mercenaries fled downriver, their carefully planned extraction becoming a desperate escape. The evidence of justice would follow them wherever they ran. Eduardo had made sure of that. The new beginning symbol was a small silver locket that Sarah found in Eduardo's desk 3 days after Marcus's failed extraction attempt. Inside, beneath a photograph of her grandmother as a young woman, was an inscription in Eduardo's careful handwriting. For Sarah, who learned that strength was always there, waiting to be discovered. Colombian authorities had concluded their investigation with remarkable efficiency. Marcus and his surviving mercenaries were in custody, facing charges that would keep them occupied for decades. Amazonia Holdings was under international investigation, their assets frozen while prosecutors built cases in 3 countries. Sarah sat in Eduardo's living room, watching Emma play with wooden toys, while lawyers from Leticia explained her legal situation in terms she was still learning to believe. The inheritance is completely legitimate, the senior attorney assured her. More than that, your great-uncle's documentation protects you from any future challenges. The property, the assets, everything is legally yours. The assets. Sarah almost laughed at the clinical term. The lawyers had no idea about the master cache, about chambers full of gold that represented more wealth than most countries possessed. They were focused on the property deed and the modest trust fund Eduardo had established for public accounting purposes. There is one complication, the attorney continued. Your husband's legal challenge has been withdrawn, but his associates filed claims suggesting you were involved in their illegal operation. And the evidence your great-uncle compiled makes it clear that you were a victim, not a participant. The prosecutor has recommended that no charges be filed against you. Sarah nodded calmly. Inside, she marveled at Eduardo's foresight. Even from beyond death, he'd protected her from legal complications she couldn't have anticipated. Carlos entered the room, carrying supplies from town. Over the past 3 days, he'd become something like a brother, helping her understand the network of relationships Eduardo had built throughout the region. The gold must be reported to the Colombian government eventually, he said quietly, out of earshot of the lawyers. But Eduardo, he established legal frameworks for that too. Cultural heritage protections, indigenous rights treaties, conservation easements. When the time comes, you will have options. Sarah understood. Eduardo had spent 30 years not just protecting the treasure, but preparing legal pathways for its eventual disclosure. He'd known that secrets couldn't last forever, but he'd ensured that when they were revealed, the family would maintain control over their legacy. What about Emma's future? Sarah asked. The trust fund Eduardo established will pay for her education through university, the attorney said. Beyond that, there are investment accounts that should provide financial security for several generations. Several generations. Sarah looked at her daughter, building elaborate castles with blocks, and realized that Emma would never face the financial desperation that had defined Sarah's recent life. More than that, Emma would grow up understanding that family legacies were worth protecting, that some responsibilities were more important than personal convenience. "Mama," Emma said, looking up from her blocks, "are we going to stay in Uncle Eduardo's house forever?" Sarah opened a silver locket and looked at her grandmother's photograph. The young woman in the picture had the same determined expression Sarah saw in her own mirror now. "For a while, sweetheart. This is our home now." "Good," Emma said, returning to her blocks. "I like the secret rooms." Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle beside Eduardo's jade charm. Symbols of the past and promise of the future, reminding her that she wasn't just Sarah Martinez anymore. She was the latest guardian in a chain that stretched back centuries, and she was finally ready for that responsibility. The family heirloom was a delicate gold ring that had belonged to the first Martinez woman to guard the treasure, centuries before Sarah was born. Emma discovered it while exploring a chamber they hadn't found before. nestled in a small box carved with the same spiral patterns that appeared throughout Eduardo's house. "Look, Mama," Emma said, holding the ring up to catch the morning light streaming through their kitchen window. "It's like the one you threw away, but prettier." Sarah smiled, remembering her wedding ring lying in some Phoenix pawn shop, sold to buy groceries during their darkest days. That ring had represented promises broken and trust betrayed. This one represented something entirely different. "That ring is very special, sweetheart. It belonged to your great-great-great-grandmother, and her great-grandmother before that. Will it belong to me someday, when you're older and ready to understand what it means?" 6 months had passed since Marcus's failed extraction attempt. The seasons had changed in the jungle, bringing different birds and flowers, different rhythms of rain and sunshine. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs that marked time's passage in this place that existed outside normal calendars. Emma had thrived in their new life. She spoke Spanish now, played with children from Carlos's village, and moved through Eduardo's house like a jungle creature born to its hidden passages. The trauma of her parents' broken marriage seemed to fade with each day spent exploring chambers full of ancient treasures and swimming in the river that had become their backyard. Sarah had changed too. The woman who'd fled Phoenix in desperation no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that strength wasn't something you found in moments of crisis. Strength was something you built day by day through choices that honored the people who'd sacrificed for your future. She'd established a foundation to manage the legal disclosure of Eduardo's collection, working with Colombian authorities to ensure the cultural treasures were preserved while maintaining family stewardship. The process would take years, but Sarah had years now. She had time to plan. Time to prepare Emma for her eventual responsibilities, time to build relationships with the community that had protected their legacy. "Will I have to fight bad people like you did?" Emma asked, trying the ring on her small finger. "I hope not, baby girl, but if you do, you'll be ready." Emma nodded seriously, then handed the ring back to Sarah. "I think you should wear it for now, until I'm big enough." Sarah slipped the ancient ring onto her finger, feeling its perfect fit. 5 centuries of Martinez women had worn this ring while making impossible choices, facing dangerous enemies and protecting treasures that belonged to generations not yet born. Now it was her turn to carry that responsibility forward. Through their window, Sarah could see the white ibis that had become a daily visitor, perched on the same branch where it had waited months ago. Carlos's boat was approaching from the river, bringing supplies and news from the outside world that seemed increasingly distant. This was their sanctuary now, Eduardo's impossible house that had become their home, a place where secrets were safe, where family legacies were honored, where a single mother and her daughter could build a future worthy of the past that had shaped them. Emma returned to her morning routine of feeding the colorful birds that gathered outside their kitchen. Sarah watched her daughter's easy happiness and knew that sometimes the most important treasures weren't hidden in underground chambers. Sometimes they were sitting right in front of you, building bird feeders and humming songs while planning adventures in a jungle castle that had been waiting centuries for them to arrive.